It's FYF Sportsman, it's Lamont. We are back with another NBA season recap on another team. That team is none other than the Brooklyn Nets. Again, a team that, you know, I would have to admit that this team was scary going into this season. And when they made the trade for James Harden, a lot of people felt like it was a done deal. This team was going to win the NBA championship, but, you know, the basketball guys said otherwise when we saw Kyrie Irving and James Harden both go down with injury in the playoffs. That really derailed their chances against the Milwaukee Bucks. And we saw the Milwaukee Bucks advance to play the Hawks and then went on to advance to the NBA Finals right now, where that Finals is tied up 2-2 with the Phoenix Suns. So the Brooklyn Nets, going into this season, a lot of people felt like it was championship or bust. And it had to be championship or bust because when you have three players of this caliber and you're carrying three max salaries, your championship window is always going to be smaller than other teams because there's only so many seasons where you can carry that much salary without it detrimentally affecting your level of competition on the court. And we saw that eventually and slowly happen with the Golden State Warriors. Yeah, it looked great when KD first got there. Right, then that next year it just didn't look the same, even though they still won. And then that third year, well, everybody's just everything from chemistry, off the court to on court issues to injuries, everything just fell apart. And then without that depth on the bench, the basketball guys always find a way to peek their heads up at the craziest times when you think you've loaded your team up with a large number of superstar caliber players. So the Brooklyn Nets definitely, didn't get the job done this year. Would have loved to see that team at full strength against the Milwaukee Bucks, but when you bring on a guy like Kyrie Irving, you know what comes with that. He's been injured a lot during the playoffs throughout his career. So you have to keep that in mind when you even take a contract like that on. Is his availability? Is he going to be able to hold up throughout the season? James Harden, they made a trade for James Harden. He came into the season slightly overweight. Was there a potential for injury with him being out of shape? And we saw that rear his head as well as he developed those hamstring injuries. So we got a lot to talk about. The first thing we're going to be discussing is just a recap of this particular team. We're going to get to that recap, and then we're going to break down what the Brooklyn Nets can do to improve their roster going into next season. Anytime there are multiple star players on the roster, there's pressure to win it all. And the Brooklyn Nets have three stars in James Harden, Kyrie Irving, and Kevin Durant. Unfortunately, they were unable to make the conference finals after losing to the Milwaukee Bucks in Game 7 of the semifinals. It was an epic final game of the year, highlighted by a historic performance by Kevin Durant, whose 48 points were the most ever in an NBA playoff Game 7. The Nets went shot for shot with the Milwaukee Bucks through the second half with 20 lead changes and 10 ties, but in the end, the Milwaukee Bucks were victorious. The offseason begins with the team's three best players, Durant, Irving, and Harden, all eligible for huge contract extensions. These stars could also play out next season and become free agents in 2022. The Nets also have 9 free agents, including Green, Blake Griffin, and Brown. Dinwiddie is also reportedly declining his option and becoming an unrestricted free agent. With limited cap space, the Nets may choose to pursue sign and trade options for Dinwiddie. In all, the summer comes down to the big three. Extending the three stars will put the Nets in range for one of the largest luxury tax payments in NBA history. However, with an owner willing to spend for championships, the hefty tax bill may be worth it. Also, if all three players are committing long-term, it could entice other free agents to take pay cuts and join their team. All right, there we have it right there, man. The Brooklyn Nets off-season outlook. As I just mentioned earlier, they have a number of upcoming free agents and a lot of questions to really get to the nitty-gritty and figure out. We got to start with Spencer Dinwiddie, probably the most valuable asset that they have on this roster. Does Spencer Dinwiddie stay with this team in a lesser role? Does he look to seek maybe a more integral role with another team? I mean, there are a number of teams out there that would love to have his services. I've been hearing the Boston Celtics. We talk about the Chicago Bulls as well. Is he a true point guard for that team? All right. Would he be a good fit for the Los Angeles Lakers? The Lakers have been eyeing a sign and trade, potentially wanting to move Dennis Schroeder. Could that potentially work? They have 2 stars that look like they want to switch spots. All right, but Dinwiddie more than likely will not be in a Brooklyn Nets uniform next season. If he does stay with the Nets, that does greatly enhance their championship aspirations. But it just doesn't look like that's what his intentions are. We have Blake Griffin, who I don't think he's going to be playing on a minimum deal as many thought. He was with Brooklyn on a buyout, but he showed in the playoffs this year that he still has a lot to give a team in the tank, especially if he doesn't have to be the #1 guy. Will a team like the Portland Trail Blazers? Will a team like the Golden State Warriors, who've also been eyeing Blake Griffin? Will a team like the Los Angeles Lakers maybe or potentially lure a guy like Blake Griffin over to the Western Conference? You have Jeff Green. Jeff Green was solid, gave some big games in the playoffs. He could potentially be back on a minimum deal. We got Bruce Brown. Bruce Brown, obviously, I think he's looking to get paid. He had a great year. He proved himself to be one of the better defenders on this team. All right, he struggled with his shot, but I think he can potentially go somewhere and get a payday. Tyler Johnson, very solid guard. They could bring him back on a minimum contract. We got Lawoo Cabarrot. Solid season. I like the way this player started off the season. He looked solid, but then towards the end of the year, he fell out of the rotation. And then we have Mike James, the renowned overseas vet who just lit up European basketball, came over here, gave the Brooklyn Nets a lot of great minutes when Kyrie Irving went down. Can they retain him, even though Mike James has came out publicly and said he would like to go back to play in Europe? Tools to improve the roster. Well, as we stated earlier, the Nets don't really have much flexibility. They have to figure things out with their 3-star players. Do they extend these players? So if their goal is to extend these players, well, now that limits what they actually are willing or going to be willing to do with some of these other free agents. So we may see a lot of these guys walk just so they can keep space available to re-sign their big 3. But they do have a taxpayer mid-level exception. It's approximately $5.6 million. Key moves to make. We have to decide on the future with restricted free agent Bruce Brown and Mike James. What can they do with those 2 players? Do they keep those guys? I could see an NBA team maybe slightly overpaying to lure Mike James away. He's that talented. When you have Bruce Brown is a very solid guard. If you look at a team like the Charlotte Hornets, they could use a backup guard like Bruce Brown. He comes in, he makes plays, he doesn't make a lot of bad plays, he plays hard, and they could use somebody in that backup point guard, shooting guard spots. Now, I don't think he's a true point guard, but defensively, he can guard any point guard in the league, and that's where teams like the Charlotte Hornets struggle. All right, so I mean, a lot of these players on this team, they're going to be vying for spots, at least, especially vital role positions on other teams, especially if those teams are willing to pay. Lastly, hope to God that non-bird right and taxpayer in mid-level exception is good enough to re-sign Jeff Green and Blake Griffin. Will the taxpayer mid-level exception be good enough to re-sign those 2 players? I believe that a team will pay slightly above market value to bring in Blake Griffin. And then again, Jeff Green continues to show year after year after year that in the playoffs, he can always be a vital component to your team. He's a high IQ player. He can play multiple positions. Even with this Nets team, they asked him to play their center position. He was able to do that to a sufficient level. So, again, it's going to be extremely tough for this team to keep these guys, but then also keep enough cap and foresight available to make sure that they can extend all 3 of these guys. Will all of these 3 guys agree? We've been hearing whispers that potentially Kyrie's not as happy as we thought he would be. But, I don't see him leaving. But again, you have to take those things into consideration. You're dealing with 3 guys, at least with KD and Kyrie, who bounced around the league. They get, they lose interest. They get discontent with their situations. And when they do, they like to leave and get to new situations. Will we see that in Brooklyn this year? Now, there we have it with the Brooklyn Nets. The Nets have a number of decisions to make. I think going into next season, they're definitely going to come into the season with a less talented roster. There's no way they can bring all of these guys back with this much talent. I mean, they just have to look to what they have, maybe look to develop Joe Harris more. They're going to have to get a lot more out of him going in the next season, all right, especially with the money he's making, that $85 million. All right, when you got guys, you got, like, obviously you got KD, Harden, and Kyrie. Man, those guys are locks. We know what they're going to do, but what can they put around these guys? The center, ever since they traded Jared Allen, the center spot has been a big question mark. Blake Griffin and Jeff Green had to be makeshift centers for this team. And ultimately, that was their demise against the Milwaukee Bucks. They had nobody to stop Giannis. They had nobody to stop Brook Lopez. Those things ultimately were their demise. Can they create some cap somewhere? Can they bring in a player who can help fill some of those voids? I want you guys, let me know what you think. There's not a lot out there available in the free agent market. Will guys be willing to take less money just to join this team? And will guys take less money to join this team knowing that a championship is not guaranteed? Because you're dealing with 3 superstar players who've shown themselves to now be injury prone, and now they're a year older. So, again, appreciate you guys for watching this NBA recap of the Brooklyn Nets. Make sure you hit the comments. Make sure you let us know your thoughts on this. We'll be going live when the day this video drops. When we go live, don't hesitate to join the live chat. Come in, chop it up. I want y'all thoughts on the Brooklyn Nets. Like I said, I didn't pick them to win the chip last year. I just thought they lacked defense. Next year, this roster is going to be less talented. Probably also meaning if they lose a guy like Bruce Brown, that their defense is going to get worse as well. Can they sustain? Are they going to be able to hit that switch and then just be competitive in the playoffs? A lot for Steve Nash and his roster. That his coaching staff has taken a few hits. He lost his top assistant. Is he going to be able to replace him with a viable candidate? But it's FYF Sports. It's been another great podcast episode. We'll be back with more sports and news later. Again, make sure you guys tune into the live stream. We will be going live. Hey, but until then, it's FYF Sports.